Shalom, everyone. Welcome back to Kevin's Biblical Discussions. Doing my first episode of Video Review Night. I want to make a series out of this, just something fun to do, and it could be edifying. I originally was going to review some Leighton Flowers videos, but I decided to push that back because I thought this topic would be more appropriate considering that today was Resurrection Sunday. So we're going to look at a video Mike Winger did showing historical evidence for the empty tomb, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's what I'm going to be reviewing tonight. So I'm not sure how long ago he put this video out. I don't know. But it's got over 40,000 views, so I'm assuming he's got some good information in here. So, without further ado, let's get to the review.
Okay, so the first reason, number one, is a term that historians call multiple attestation. That is, there's multiple sources attesting to the truthfulness of a specific thing. So what we have with the empty tomb of Jesus is we have it actually recorded in every one of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, already some people just slow down. Like if you're like a skeptic who's thinking, already thinking, what kind of bologna sauce is Mike going to spill out of his mouth today? I just want you to make sure you understand me before you try to refute me here. Think it through. Okay, so there's four sources. These are four different documents: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in their in the documents themselves, in every one of these Gospels, the empty tomb and the burial of Christ.
Yeah, that is true. That each Gospel is written by someone different. It's four different sources. I would count that as historical evidence. Now, Muslims will use their Quran as historical evidence for their beliefs. But when Christians do it, it's not okay. But it's okay when Muslims do it, even though their ancient sources don't line up with reality. But that's another topic. I don't know. Maybe I'll review some David Wood videos too. I think that'd be fun. Yeah, I think we will do that. And Sam, I don't know if you're still there, but what's up, my man? Thanks for tuning in. Oh yeah, the StreamYard link. Let me drop the StreamYard link in case there's anyone that wants to come in and partake in the video review that has some chats or comments about the video or whatever, and you're welcome to join. All right, back to it.
This burial and resurrection tomb related information. It's flowing with the narrative. It consistently flows through, meaning it's not like, say, for instance, in Mark, a lot of Mark's information is kind of staccato, if you know the musical terms. It's sort of like he jumps into a story and then he jumps into a new story and into a new story. But the death, the burial, and the resurrection is one story, one single narrative story. And that's the case in all of the Gospels. But there's more information than this. As scholars have found, as they study and compare the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there's independent sources between all four of them, specifically relating to the empty tomb. So while the narrative flows, implying that it's coming from a single source, the sources themselves seem independent because they're not just depending on others. For instance, Matthew and Luke often quote Mark. They often quote Mark, but not about the empty tomb. They're just having an independent account of that empty tomb. So it's non-Markan material. It's unique to Matthew, unique to Luke, unique to Mark, and unique to John in these different attestations. But there's more. There's the sermons in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, we have these early church sermons, and they predate the book of Acts. Now, some people would think that the book of Acts was wholesale made up on the spot. That is, I think that's a whole different debate. Well, I want to do a video one day on the historicity of Luke and just Luke and Acts, and that would just be a neat video. But tons of data there and way too much for today. So for now, I'll say this. I'm going to give you what historians and critical, scholars of the New Testament have agreed upon. This is not my information I'm making up on the spot here. In the book of Acts, there's certain Semitisms or Semitic phrases and terms that don't fit with the writing style of Luke, implying that Luke is quoting an actual person from before his time. So these Semitisms are embedded in the preachments in Acts, where you have Peter giving the gospel out to people, things like that. And he's giving the empty tomb narrative in those preachments, meaning that that information predates Luke and it predates the writing of the book of Acts. And so we have additional sources there. There's implications in Mark that the empty tomb is a pre-Markan story that Mark is relaying to us, but it's not coming from him. So here we have at least six different sources for the empty tomb narrative. Now, to compare this to other things in ancient history, I realize this, that first century information, we know very little about the first century compared to what happened during it. But the information we have about the empty tomb coming from six sources, that's pretty impressive. We have historical pay dirt. When historians see two different sources talking about one event, they consider that total confirmation. Like, yeah, two different sources, one event, that event probably happened. Here we have at least six. So, yeah, listen up. That's just one reason, okay? That's just one reason to believe in the historicity of the empty tomb. Here's another one. So we have multiple attestation. The second reason is early attestation, or evidence that the stories aren't just in lots of sources, but they go back to early sources. And this is ideal. This is exactly what the historian wants as they're looking at history. I want lots of people telling me about it, and I want them to tell me about it shortly after it happened. First off, I'll say this: every document in our New Testament in the Bible that we've got from Matthew all the way to Revelation, all those documents, they're all first century documents. In the 1700s, there was a lot of theories going out there. If you were reading scholars back then, you may have been convinced that these documents were written much, much later, in the second or third century even. And
Yeah, and there's no evidence to believe that. I think they all were written in the first century. There's nothing to suggest otherwise. So yeah, I agree with Mike.
That's not the case. Okay, so if you had followed the majority, then you would have been in error. But now we have more evidence to support that these are all first century documents. So every single one of these goes back to the first century. All the sources I've mentioned, and some I haven't mentioned yet that I'll get into in a little bit. But it gets better than that, because Mark's source material for his narrative in the Gospel of Mark, that source material actually probably goes to within 7 years of the events that took place. Now, this is even if you take a late dating view of the writing of Mark. You could say Mark was written in 70 AD, or it was composed near 60 AD. That's a late date for Mark. Now, there's a case for an early date, but let's take the late date even. We're still saying that the content of Mark goes back to within 7 years of the events themselves. Rudolf Pesch, scholar, says that this is partly because Mark never bothers using the name of the high priest. These are some reasons why he says it's within 7 years. If it was contemporary with Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time, and his high priestly duties were from AD 18 to 37, well, this would explain not needing to specify which high priest is in view. He doesn't mention his name because the content that he's getting is coming from within his tenure as high priest. I'll give you an example to make it easier to understand. If I'm going to say something about Donald Trump, who's president right now, I just say the president. I just say, hey, the president. But if I want to say something about Obama, who was president before, or
Okay, so confirmation: this video was definitely made before President Biden was president. So this is definitely over a year old. That's cool. Yeah, that's cool. Let's hear the evidence.
Bush or one of the Bushes, then I need to mention their names. I have to say President Obama, President Bush. I have to be specific about which one I'm talking about. But if they're currently in office, I just mention them by their title because everyone knows. So the story in Mark has these sort of unintentional hints at its early dating within 7 years. There's more information, though. There's an expression in Mark that is used that is the phrase on the first day of the week when they come to visit the tomb is on the first day of the week. Now, later on in church history, by the time even the epistles are being written, the common terminology here is the third day, on the third day, because they would date it from the day of his crucifixion. But Mark, seeming to preserve an even earlier tradition, just calls it the first day of the week. So this is one of the reasons why Rudolf Pesch suggests that it's within 7 years. So not long after the events of Jesus' death, they changed the terminology to the third day, just like it is in 1 Corinthians 15. But here we have on the first day of the week. It's awkward in the Greek, and it seems to come from an Aramaic expression, which pushes it back as well to an authentic Aramaic,
I would just have to take his word for that because I don't know anything about that. So, I don't think Mike Winger would have any reason to lie about that, so I guess I'll just take him on his word on that, unless I find out something otherwise.
Story from within a very brief period of time. Also, this is kind of neat. Mark's narrative, it's just super straightforward. It's we don't notice this when you're reading the Bible just for devotional purposes, but you don't notice how straightforward and sort of plain it is. It's unadorned. In other words, it shows no signs of legendary development. Let me give you an example of legendary development. Um, Mark, of course, talks about how Jesus, he was crucified, he was buried, he raised again. They came to see the tomb and they heard the announcement of his resurrection. And then we're told to go see the disciples and tell them, and that Jesus was going to appear to Peter and the rest. That's the Mark story in a nutshell. But when we compare this to later Gnostic gospels, or gospels that were written by people who were not really connected to eyewitnesses, they were just trying to kind of hijack some version of Christianity for themselves. They have legendary development in their gospels. One of the interesting stories around this is from the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter is a 2nd century document, and I'll read it to you now. This is from the Gospel of Peter, section 35 through 42. I'm just reading to you the narrative, and listen to how different it is. This is what it sounds like when legendary development creeps in, which shows you that it's a later writing and not an early source. Here's the Gospel of Peter on the day of the resurrection. It says, "But in the night in which the Lord's day dawned, when the soldiers were safeguarding it 2 by 2 in every watch, there was a loud voice in heaven. And they saw that the heavens were opened, and that 2 males who had much radiance had come down from there and had come near the sepulchre. But that stone which had been thrust against the door, having rolled by itself, went a distance off to the side, and the sepulchre opened, and both the young men entered. And so those soldiers, having seen, awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were present, safeguarding." So the first thing we notice in the Gospel of Peter is there's this loud voice that wakes them up so that they can witness these things. Now the witnesses in the Gospel of Peter, they're not going to be the women. It's going to happen in front of the centurions, the elders of the people of Israel. So we're talking about the Jewish leadership. They're all there. Literally, the elders are sleeping around the tomb, because this will bolster the story, because we'll get there later, but women witnesses are not a positive thing in their view. So the gospel.
Yeah, unfortunately, the testimony of women didn't hold to the same weight as a testimony of man back then. Not just in Israel, but in pretty much all of the ancient world was like that. So it wasn't uncommon for women's testimonies to not mean much. Unfortunately.
Of Peter changes the story to make it sound more robust. And then we go on in verse or section 39. He says, "And while they were relating what they had seen, and they again they see 3 males who have come out from the sepulcher, with the 2 supporting the other one and a cross following them." So these 2 angels are holding up Jesus, is the idea. And there's a cross that comes out of the tomb. There's a cross that comes out of the tomb, and it's following them like it's moving on its own. Listen to the description of these guys. It says, "And the head of the 2 reaching unto heaven," somehow they've grown, because they got into the tomb, 2 young men, radiant, but they went in the tomb. Now they've grown. Their heads reach up into heaven, but that of the one being led by a hand by them, going beyond the heavens. So Jesus is now, he can't even see his head. He's thousands of feet high. And then verse 41 or section 41, "And they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, Have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep, or to the dead? And an obeisance was heard from the cross. Yes." So the cross itself audibly speaks. This is what you call legendary development. Mark doesn't show these signs of legendary development. Now, there's a reason why the Gospel of Peter is not in our Bible, right? This is what Peter didn't write it, right? Somebody else wrote this thing. It's a weird work from the 2nd century. It shows you just how historical in nature the Gospels are compared to things like this. But I go on, because Mark's content potentially being, at least Rudolf Pesch thinks, within 7 years of the original events themselves, which is incredibly early. 2,000 years later, we have content that's that close. There's actually an earlier source that we have in the New Testament. It's the earliest piece of your Bible, and it's in 1 Corinthians 15. So 1 Corinthians 15, it records, and I'm going to put it on the screen for you guys. It records this. So this is the statement that Paul relates to the Corinthians, and he writes this probably about 55 AD. Okay, maybe around 55 AD. He's writing First Corinthians, which is really near. I mean, we're talking within 25 years of the death and resurrection. But the content itself doesn't originate with Paul, and I'm going to walk you through it to show you why, not me, but why the overwhelming majority of scholars agree that this content goes way before Paul. So this is historical content dating to probably within 5 years of the actual events themselves. So it says in 1 Corinthians 15:3, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." Now, these words right here are the first like red flags for the scholars. They tell us that this content I delivered, these terms, what I also received, is like a formula by which someone says, "Hey, I'm handing off to you official tradition, official like oral history that we have that's been handed to me and preserved, and I'm handing it off to you." What's more is what follows is written as a creed. Like it's a, we've heard of church creeds. Well, this would be the first creed in the church probably, and it says that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and then it appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And that section right there, this is not a minority opinion. They believe this is within 5 years of the death and resurrection of Christ, and it traces to a Jerusalem source.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wish Graham was here because I think he said something before about which one of the books of the New Testament was actually the first book written. And I think, was it Corinthians might have been the first one of the Apostle Paul's letters. I think Corinthians was the first letter he wrote, but I might be wrong on that. But this, yeah, First Corinthians might be the first epistle that Paul actually did write. I not sure, but I think maybe the oldest book is Mark, but I'm not sure on that either. And I wish Graham was here because I'm pretty sure he has a lot more information about that. But anyway, yeah. Yeah, for I delivered it to you as I first importance what I also received. Yeah, that does kind of sound like a decree. Like I received something and now I'm passing it to you. That Christ died for our sins, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have any disagreements or anything so far. It's getting interesting. Again, the StreamYard link is in the description. Or I'm sorry, not in the description, but in the side chat. If anyone has any information about this kind of stuff and wants to contribute to the show, you're welcome to come on. Or if you have comments about the video, feel free to hop in. And yeah, get back to the video.
So we're saying that the death, burial, and resurrection, notice it's a sequence. Death, he died, he was buried, he was raised. That this is going back to that very early source. Jerome Murphy O'Connor, he passed away, but he was a leading authority on St. Paul and professor of the New Testament at the École Biblique in Jerusalem. He said the following. He said that a literary analysis has produced complete agreement, and I quote him here, complete agreement among critical scholars that Paul introduces a quotation in verse 3b, which is the section I just read to you. Complete agreement. Then how early is it? Well, within 5 years. Why do we say within 5 years? Well, Jesus' crucifixion, that's about 30 AD. 1 Corinthians, again, was about 55 AD, but the saying is older, and he had to have received it. Well, Paul himself, he could have received it when he was converted, maybe about 33 AD. His conversion happens. He's in Damascus. He could have got.
Yeah, that's how I would take it. When he got converted, yeah, when Jesus met him on the road to Damascus and he blinded him, and then he ran into, I think it was Barnabas, and he got his eyesight back. They probably told him that Jesus rose from the dead, and yeah.
Got it from the disciples there. There were already Christians there. They could have told him, so it could have happened right then. But at the latest, he would have had to have had it by 36 AD because Paul spent 2 weeks with Peter and James at Jerusalem. We read about this in Galatians 1. And we're just reading the text here as a historical document, okay? Here's an ancient first century document written by the guy talking about his travels. He says, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. Now, here's something interesting. That word visit, it doesn't do it justice in the English. In the Greek, it's the word hystoresai. And here's the definition for it. I'll put some Greek up for you. I don't do that too often, but for Greek, we give the root word, okay, historeo, but it's hystoresai. It's just the way it's called the lexical form. So the lexical form is historeo, and it is knowing to ascertain by inquiry and personal examination. This is the verb from which the English word history is derived. Why is that significant? Because ancient historians would use this term to say, I'm going to examine like eyewitnesses to get the history, the details behind these events so that I can know them correctly. This is a term used not just to visit Peter. No, it's way bigger than that. He's visiting to get information, to get historical information. So he would have had to have had it by this time, and it seems likely he did, because also in Galatians we read that who he saw in this trip was Peter and James, right? He saw no one other than Cephas, and didn't see any of the other apostles except James. So he saw Peter and James, those two guys. Cephas is the same as Peter. Well, in the 1 Corinthians Creed, we read that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12, and then he appeared to 500 brothers at once, and then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. The two he highlights are Peter and James, and the two he saw in Jerusalem, probably 5 to 6 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, or at least they're purported, if you're a skeptic on this. So we're saying here, this is why not me, but the vast majority, I'll quote Gary Habermas here. He's one of the premier scholars on this topic. And he says, the vast majority of critical scholars who answer the question place Paul's reception of this material in the mid-30s AD. Even more skeptical scholars generally agree. German theologian Walter Kasper even asserts that here's Habermas quoting Kasper, we have here, therefore, an ancient text, perhaps in use by the end of 30 AD. Ulrich Wilkins declares that the material indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. Here's my bottom line for you. And this is what I tweeted out earlier today. I was preparing for this and thinking about it. Christianity didn't start the belief in Jesus' resurrection. It was the belief in Jesus' resurrection that started Christianity.
Well, I want to expand on that a little more, actually. So, first of all, Christianity is actually biblical Judaism. Yeah, that's right. So, if you read in, I think it's the book of Acts, it says that they were called Christians first at Antioch, which was a place, a city, and it was a derogatory term. Oh, they're Christians because Christ, Christian. But honestly, if they had not started calling these people Christians, they would have just been known as Jews. It's Judaism, because if you go back to Jeremiah, I believe it's chapter 31, talks about establishing a new covenant with thy people. This is that new covenant he's established with his people. This is a continuation of Judaism. The New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old. All the prophecies in the Old are being fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And there's still some prophecies yet to come, like the 70th week of Daniel. So technically, if that derogatory term hadn't caught on and people started calling them Christians, now obviously today we don't take it as a derogatory term. We wear the term proudly. Yeah, they call us Christians. We're Christians. But had they not called them Christians, this would have been called Judaism. Because what's Judaism today isn't Judaism at all. And that's a whole nother topic. Maybe we can get into that sometime too. Maybe Iger would like to join for that one. But anyway, back to the stream.
That's the thing. This death, burial, resurrection, and the testimony of the empty tomb, this started Christianity. It wasn't a later addition, later thing that was put onto Christianity. No, it's the core. That's how it began. Now, some people object, and I don't have time to get into all these objections today to do like a full, Bible study on 1 Corinthians 15. One day, maybe I'll do that. Some guys like Richard Carrier have really fanciful theories about 1 Corinthians 15. And I think that if you have a lot of confirmation bias, you may like his theories, but they don't stand up to just reading the text. I mean, if you really read Paul and study Paul, as I've spent quite a lot of time doing, there's no way Paul's talking about some space some event out in the moon or in some place in space. It's just silly. So anyhow, that's number 3. Okay, that's number 3. We have 1, multiply attested; 2, early attestation within 5 years. We also have enemy attestation, and we get this sort of through roundabout means. Let me give it to you here. This is Matthew 28. Matthew 28:12. It says, "And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell the people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep.'" So this is the initial response as recorded by Matthew. Now, you could have different ways of approaching the text, right? You could say, "I believe the Bible, therefore they said the disciples stole the body." But you could even be a skeptic, and you can start by saying, "I don't believe the Bible is accurate. I don't believe it's true. I don't trust it. But here's what I can tell. I can tell there's first century records that the early church is trying to fight the spreading rumor that the disciples stole the body." And that we can all agree on. They're trying to fight the rumor that the disciples stole the body of Christ. Well, how are they fighting it?
Yeah, and that rumor I think was started because the guards that were in charge of looking over Jesus' tomb, when they saw the angels, they were told to guard the tomb with their lives. So if that body went missing, those soldiers are going to be put to death. Right? They had to come up with some sort of excuse. Well, the disciples came and they overwhelmed us and they stole the body or something. But they know that the angels were there. They saw them. People will go to ridiculous measures to save their lives, but instead of just coming to the truth and acknowledging what they saw and saying, "Wow, Jesus really was Lord and Savior. He really was the Christ," like the Jews have said, and getting saved and counting themselves dead for the cause of Christ, they decide to hold on to their lives, and we're going to tell a lie and preserve our earthly lives for now. But did they get eternity? I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. I doubt they got saved. Hope they did, though.
Explaining where the rumor came from. This means that it was really, honestly, something the enemies were saying. Now, if there was no burial, if there was no tomb, and if it was never empty, why would they say the disciples stole the body? They're not doing it for people 2,000 years later. This is
great point, Mike. That's a great point right there. Matter of fact, I'm going to rewind that. Let's hear that point one more time. That's a really good point.
Now, if there was no burial, if there was no tomb, and if it was never empty, why would they say the disciples stole the body?
Exactly. Great point.
They're not doing it for people 2,000 years later. This is happening in the moment, in the first century. They're just saying, look, the disciples stole the body, which admits that there was really an empty tomb and the body could not be located. It admits that. That much is an admission there. There's some other sources that give us this too. Justin Martyr, in his dialogue with Trypho, which is a debate he's having, sometimes when we do this sometimes too nowadays, you have like these, they would write like a dialogue. Justin Martyr's an apologist, early church apologist, 2nd century, and he's writing like in a debate form where he writes out the arguments of his Jewish opponents who are non-Christians, who are not messianic, they don't follow Christ. And here's some of the things that he puts in the mouths of the opponents. In other words, what we're getting is in the middle of the 2nd century, this is Justin Martyr's Dialogues with Trypho, section 108. We're getting, and this is what the Jews were saying to combat Christianity. So we can hear the enemy attestation. Here's what it says. "Yet you not only have not repented after you learned that he rose from the dead, but as I said before, you have sent chosen and ordained men throughout all the world to proclaim that a godless and lawless heresy had sprung from one Jesus, a Galilean deceiver, whom we crucified, but his disciples stole him by night from the tomb where he was laid when unfastened from the cross, and now deceive men by asserting that he is risen from the dead and ascended to heaven." So this statement from Justin, he's arguing with Trypho, this discussion's going on, and he's saying, hey, you Jews are continuing to spread the rumor, but that's not true. We didn't steal his body. His body wasn't stolen. No, he's really risen. And so there's more sort of unintentional admission from the enemies of the gospel saying that the empty tomb is actually a historical thing. Tertullian also wrote at the end of the 2nd century in Of Spectacles, section 30. He's quoting a Jewish claim there, and here we again see how now, don't get me wrong, there were Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians. So he's quoting Jewish non-Christians. He's quoting the Jewish non-Christians here, and it says, "This is he whom his disciples secretly stole away, that it might be said he had risen again. Or the gardener abstracted that his lettuces might come to no harm from the crowds of visitants." What is he talking about lettuces for? This is kind of a funny section in Tertullian. What it's saying is that the claim of the time was trying to come up with other explanations for how the tomb got empty. And 2 explanations are offered. One, the disciples stole the body. The other, the gardener, because he was buried near a garden, the gardener didn't want people trampling his lettuces as they were visiting the tomb, so he took the body and buried it somewhere else. But apparently he didn't tell anybody, because now even more people are coming to the tomb to see it because it's empty instead of occupied. But this is just admitting, yes, there was an empty tomb. And that's the purpose of this video. I could deal with the objections, the claim the disciples stole the body. This is not tenable. You can't sustain that reasonably. But it proves that there really was an empty tomb, or at least it points to it. That's 4. Let's look at number 5. Number 5 is easy. Let's look at a list of all the competing traditions, all the sources we have from history that say that Jesus wasn't buried, and that or that he was buried and the tomb was still occupied. There are none. That's number 5. There's no competing traditions. There's plenty of people wanting to refute Christianity at this stage, trying to refute it, arguing about it. None of them challenge the empty tomb. I think that's pretty significant. Number 6.
Yeah, I agree. That is pretty significant, especially because it's so close to the date. There's people alive that would have witnessed Jesus walking around. There's people that knew the things were true, that he was crucified, so they couldn't deny that he existed. So they're arguing that the disciples stole the body, but there's no evidence of that. It's just the witness of what? The Roman centurion that was guarding the tomb that lied?
The testimony of women. And we're going to get in detail on this because this has been challenged a lot. And in the atheist community, if you're part of this atheist community that you follow these things, you already are loading in your head why the testimony of women doesn't matter. But let me answer those objections, and let me give you some specifics today. And by the way, I hope you guys, this is a blessing for you. I hope I'm jamming through tons of content today, and I plan on doing a lot. I want this to be a resource you could watch again and again to gather these sort of like individual like pieces of ammo in a case that points towards the evidence for the empty tomb, because the empty tomb points very clearly to the real literal resurrection of Christ. It's the only
Amen.
good explanation for that fact. Okay, how were women witnesses viewed? Well, first I should say this. The gospel accounts record women as being the first ones to both find the tomb, to know where the tomb was, to find the tomb afterwards, to see the tomb was empty, and the first ones to see Jesus. And this is embarrassing for the time. Women were not respected as far as being witnesses, in particular for being witnesses. So let me give you some examples. I have the Mishnah somewhere. Where did I put it? There's my Mishnah. Okay, so the Mishnah, these are Jewish writings, considered authoritative Jewish writings, part of the whole Talmud and the source material that they're going to look at, that Jews are looking at. And here's what the Mishnah Rosh Hashanah, chapter 1, verse 8 says. These are considered unfit witnesses. These are people who you should not listen to when they're witnesses. Gamblers with dice, those that lend with interest.
And all the cults do that, I want to point out. Every single cult, well, maybe not everyone, actually, just about every cult that exists in the world today goes to sources outside of their, quote, holy book, unquote. Like, if you have something that was divinely given to humanity by God, why would you need outside sources to go along with it? Like, if God has given you something, that's all you need. The words and wisdom of men mean nothing. All you need is the Bible. And the Jews had started this years and years and years and years and years, way before Jesus came. When they were in Babylonian captivity, they started this nonsense with the Talmud. Now, it started out as an honest commentary, but then as the volumes kept going and going, it got heretical and more heretical and disgusting and demonic. And then stemming out from that, we get Kabbalism. The Kabbalah is a Jewish book of mysticism, and I say Jewish lightly, as in it was made by Hebrew people, but it has nothing to do with Judaism whatsoever. And again, another cult that would label itself as a form of Judaism. But all you need is the Bible. Just like the Muslims, right? They say the Quran is the word of God. Well, then why do you need all these hadiths and stuff? Why can't you just stick with the Quran? Every cult does that. The Roman Catholics do it. They always go to church fathers. And then what does the Pope say about things? So the Bible by itself isn't enough. We need all this other nonsense and garbage and rubbish to go with it. That's one good way to identify a cult. Jehovah's Witnesses do it, the Watchtower magazine and Tract Society. Mormons do it. They add the Book of Mormon to the Bible. Right? It's easy to identify. Anyone that says, oh, the Bible alone isn't enough, you need this. Yeah, you're a cult. Red flag.
Pigeon racers, they know about you guys. Those who trade in the produce of the sabbatical year, and slaves. This is the rule of those 5 people. All testimony that a woman is not fit to give, these are also not fit to give. That's how women are viewed at the time as witnesses. In fact, women could only testify to a couple things in court, and it was only generally if there was no men around that they would even allow a woman to testify. But she could testify to her virginity, or if her husband had died, she could go to testify, yes, he's really dead. There weren't really many other reasons why they would allow them to testify. Josephus, he says that women were too lightheaded and brash to be credible witnesses. Josephus, first century Jewish Roman historian. He says that they're too lightheaded or brash to be used, but 2 times he does use women as witnesses. 2 times. When he's talking about the slaughters at Gamala and Masada, because they were the only survivors. There were no men to appeal to. That's the only time he uses women. That was the standard then. If there's no men, I guess we'll use the women. It hurts our case, but we'll do it. Now, is this smart? Is this good? No, this is the culture of the time. And it shows you how offensive it was to people that women were being used to substantiate the central doctrinal claim of Christianity.
Yes, and usually if something is embarrassing, especially historically, it means it's usually true, right? Because back in the ancient world, like Mike was just saying, the testimony of women would have been considered embarrassing because women's testimonies didn't mean very much. So it's more likely that this is true because they're using the testimony of women. Now, if the Bible was fabricated and they really wanted to sell the point, they would have had men testify. But the fact that it's women really helps our case a lot, historically speaking. That, if you're trying to convince people that Jesus is the Christ like he claimed to be, you probably wouldn't want to have women as your initial source of testimony for him not being in the tomb. Yeah.
That Jesus had risen from the dead. Why on earth are they using women if they're making it up? If it's not historical? Josephus,
Amen.
He even changed the book of Genesis. I'm not kidding. So that Isaac, instead of Rebekah, is the one receiving revelation from God. This is in the book of his Antiquities, book 1, section 257. You compare what he writes there to Genesis. It's like he's literally changing the text because he doesn't want a woman to be the one receiving the revelation from God. Like this is the milieu of the time. I always pronounce that word wrong. Okay. That's the Jews. What about the Gentiles? What about the Gentile audience? How do they view women? See, this isn't like a Jewish thing. This is normal. Richard Bauckham, historian, he says women were regarded as, quote, gullible in religious matters and especially prone to superstitious fantasy and excessive in religious practices. That's how they were regarded back then. So they're not trusted. And he uses various sources for this. I could post those if people are interested. You probably can take my word for it, but you can look at Juvenal, Plutarch, Fronto, Felix, Clement of Alexandria, Celsus, where Origen quotes Celsus. Okay, there's some sources for you. Celsus, actually, speaking of Celsus, he's a critic of Christianity. He wants to destroy Christianity. He spends a lot of time mocking it and ridiculing it, like a lot of people do today. So he's a second century philosopher, opponent to Christianity. And according to Origen, Celsus, he talks about Celsus's attitude towards the fact that women were viewed as witnesses. Celsus actually uses this to attack Christianity, even there at its beginning. So here's what Origen said. Speaking next of the statements in the Gospels that after his resurrection, he showed the marks of his punishment, how his hands had been pierced, Celsus asks, who beheld this? And discrediting the narrative of Mary Magdalene, who is related to have seen him, he replies, a half-frantic woman, as you state. Celsus's case against the resurrection was the fact that women had seen it happen. That's his case. Celsus also said only foolish and low individuals and persons devoid of perception and slaves and women and children of whom the teachers of the divine word wish to make converts. The only Christian converts that they were getting in Celsus's opinion are, dumb people like women. so here's the thing, like, it's clear that women as witnesses is a really bad thing if you're making up a story you want others to believe. This is why the Gospel of Peter, 2nd century, changed the witnesses to be these other guys, the elders and the centurions and the soldiers. They blew up the story to make it more robust, which would help them then, but would hurt us now. Now we look back and go, no, that's fake. That was made up. Even the disciples didn't take their word for it. In Luke 24:11, it says that the women, when they came to them, it says these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. They didn't believe them right away. So this is pretty good evidence for what we call, like, embarrassment, the criterion of embarrassment. To put it the way Richard Bauckham says in talking about this issue, he says, since these narratives do not seem well designed to carry conviction of the time or to convince people, they are likely to be historical, that is, believable by people with a historically critical mindset today. This is in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I think it's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, page 259. But that's 2002. So that was before he revised it, I think. So it might be on a different page in this current, because this is version 2. Bauckham also lists 12 different scholars who support the idea that women are unlikely inventions. And he adds that, oh, my books are falling down. He adds that serious attempts to refute this argument are surprisingly rare. Like, people don't even really try to refute this. Like Mike Licona records this in his book, and he adds even more people to that list of names. And I can even add things like, I don't know, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, he comes up with an alternative scenario. Some of you guys skeptics, you know who Bart Ehrman is, right? If you're a skeptic or Muslim, you know who Bart Ehrman is. And there's like a book avalanche going on. We had an earthquake last night too, by the way. That was interesting. California. Okay, so Bart Ehrman, he initially believed that the empty tomb was historical. He said it was almost certainly historical. This was years ago. It seems like it was after his debate or during his debate with William Lane Craig that he changed his view, and he says he doesn't think the empty tomb is historical. And he goes on to say that he thinks the women made up the story. They made it up about the women because women like women, so they wanted to put women in the story. So they just fabricated it. Except we've already talked about how this goes back to so early and in the area of Jerusalem. There's good reasons why that's not the case. But here's what skeptics don't know. Bart Ehrman plays a lot of games with reality, okay? And I'm just being honest here. I'm not trying to... He does, okay? He plays a lot of games with reality. He, on one side, he says the women made it up. The women made it up because they like women, so they wanted to put women in the story. But then he goes on to say he doesn't think that that is a very smart thing to say. I mean, literally, I'm going to see if I can read from my notes here. I just accidentally covered them all up. But Bart Ehrman, he says that women making up the story is something he doesn't think is actually reasonable, but it's more reasonable than saying Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, he says a historical reconstruction of the events that's unreasonable is better than believing a miracle. This is simply his hesitance to believe in anything miraculous. So it's circular reasoning here. And this is clear when you look at enough of his material on the content. The reasonable conclusion is this: the story of women finding the empty tomb is included because women found the empty tomb. And it was so well known and so genuinely part of the story, and the people recording it were committed to truth, so they left it in there as is, even though it made it harder to share the truth of the gospel of Christ. It actually made it more difficult. And Christians, keep this in mind. We don't change the gospel to make it easier to communicate to people. We have to give them the actual gospel of Christ. I don't have to placate people with it. I have to deliver the truth and let them respond as they will.
Yeah, that's right. We don't lie to spread our beliefs around. We tell people the truth. Not like Muslims that use dawah and they lie to spread Islam. If you have the truth, you don't have to lie to spread it.
Just a side note there. Geza Vermesh, he's an unbelieving Bible scholar. Geza Vermesh. He is called the greatest Jesus scholar of his time, and he's not a Christian. He said that female witnesses had no standing in a male-dominated Jewish society. And so these are some of the reasons why he would support this as well. Okay, so that was number 6, the testimony of women. The testimony of women. There's another brief one. I'll hear number 7. I'll give you. Number 7 is that the Jewish practice of noting the gravesite of spiritual leaders. This is something Mike Licona puts in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, a historiographical approach, which is a really interesting book, and it's very hard to read. It's very long, and you have to be committed if you want to read through it. I'm just being real with you. But I have read through it, and I found it to be very rewarding, very interesting, and something worth thinking about. So in his book, he talks about how there's this actual Jewish practice at the time where you would note the burial site of a spiritual leader. And Jesus was a well-known spiritual leader. He had a large following, although, yes, it was very controversial at the time. But of course, it makes sense. It's just rational to say that they would note the site of his burial and not be clueless about what happened to his body. Number 8. Eighth piece of evidence that points towards the empty tomb being historically true. That is, this story came from Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the worst possible location to make up stories about Jerusalem. Think about it. Like, if I want to make up a story, I want to make it up about a place far away where you can't verify it, where you have to kind of take my word for it. And
that's another great point. Imagine being alive at that time and you're telling people about things that happened in Jerusalem. Like, that would be easily refuted, right? Like, it makes sense. Like, if you were going to tell a lie, you would say, oh, well, in this other place that's way over, miles and miles away, this happened. But no, right here in Jerusalem, this happened. It's a good point. Think about it. Yeah.
That's more common in the ancient world. For instance, in the life of Apollonius, Apollonius of Tyana, which we've talked about, and I have a whole video on that. The author of the life of Apollonius makes up weird, nutty stuff about India because no one who's reading his work has been to India, right? He's not going to make it up about Rome. He's not going to make it up about the locations where these people are. He makes up stuff about India, about them having giant fish cows, right? Who grow scales because they eat so much fish that the cows grow scales. Like, yeah. So that's the kind of stuff you get when you're making things up. Make it up about a faraway place. But this happens in Jerusalem. The story comes from Jerusalem. It spreads in Jerusalem. It's believed in Jerusalem. The fact that it's a Jerusalem source is evidence for the historicity of the content, not for it being fabricated. Number 9. Joseph of Arimathea seems historical. So I'm going to give you several reasons why he's historical. Why am I bringing him up? Well, in Mark and John, we read about a guy who actually gave his tomb to the purpose of burying Jesus. And his name is Joseph, and he's from a place called Arimathea. Mark and John both record it, so it's multiply attested. We have two different sources here. They're both in the Bible, but they weren't written by the same authors, and they're not coming from the same exact tradition. They're not quoting each other, right? So these are independent sources, and even the order of the events, that the way they happen, he goes and he asks for the body, then he gets the body, they bury. The order of the events themselves are consistent in Mark and John, different sources. So there's sort of indirect confirmation right there. Also, Arimathea, we've identified most likely Arimathea is Ramathion Zophim. So Arimathea, Ramathion. This is probably the same place. It's 4 or 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem. Now that's going to be important in a minute because again, the story came from Jerusalem, and we're making up a story about a guy that's just stone's throw away, who's a real guy, who turns out to be very well known, right? Because he was a member of the Sanhedrin. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. He was one of the leading people of Israel, or this group of guys that were well known to the Jews.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, that's cool.
All their names were known. And so here we have an early source, Jerusalem source, about a well-known guy who lives near Jerusalem, who has a tomb in Jerusalem. And it's also embarrassing. Here's the criterion of embarrassment that helps support Joseph of Arimathea as the guy that does the burial. Um, he's a member of the Sanhedrin who is classically against Jesus, yet he's the one who buries Jesus, not John, none of the other disciples. No one's around him to bury him. He doesn't have his own family tomb somewhere nearby, nothing like that. No, it is a guy who is not even one of the disciples. This is embarrassing to the disciples. And he's part of the Sanhedrin, which is a group that's classically known to be against Jesus, not for him. And he comes and he does this. And if it were invented, I would expect John to write that the disciple who loved Jesus put him in a tomb, or something else along those lines. So the point here is it's testable to the original hearers. They can go to this nearby town and talk to Joseph of Arimathea. He's a member of the Sanhedrin. The tomb itself is known. It's a known location in Jerusalem. These incidental details speak of historicity. There's a lot more actually about this. Matthew 27:57 says that Joseph was a rich man. That's consistent with what we read about the tomb. I'll come back to that in a minute. In John 12:42 and 43, it says that some of the people in authority believed Jesus, but hid it. So we have here just kind of this random detail thrown in the middle of John that's consistent with the end of John. Now you might think, well, John's a genius and he's crafting this careful story, but I guarantee you the same guy who says John's a genius says that John contradicts Mark and Matthew and Peter. And so I think there's something going on there when people are kind of like fighting against themselves with certain claims and statements they make about the Gospels. And it makes sense, you guys. Jesus had a following. Right now, with this online stuff, I have gotten, by God's grace, I've gotten something of a following online. And when I had trouble with YouTube, I was like, hey guys, I need help. You guys all reached out to Twitter. Tons of people tweeted out. Tons of people sent mail and messages and all this, because there's people that care about what I'm doing. Well, how much more Jesus? I mean, there's people that cared about him. And Joseph of Arimathea, being part of the Sanhedrin, he was there at the trial. Like, he knows that Jesus was railroaded through. He knows it was unjust. He knows he doesn't belong on that cross. So it makes sense that he would then go and say, hey, I'm one of the followers. I'm one of the secret disciples. Let me at least give an honorable burial.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's another good point. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this so far. Mike's bringing up some good stuff here. Let's keep going.
Now, there's an objection to this we're going to come to at the end, so stay tuned for that, because this is an area right here. What I'm talking about right now, this is what the skeptics will attack, and I want to respond to that to give you skeptics. I love you. I want to give you good reasons to be Christians, because there's I don't know, about 1 million good reasons to be Christians, and I'm going to slowly give you all of them on my YouTube channel. So, number 10, the 10th piece of evidence, the description of the tomb that we read about in the Bible. It shows signs of historicity. What do I mean? I mean, if it had been written later, if it had been invented at a later time in a different place, it wouldn't be written the way it is. Now, there's 3 different kinds of stone tombs that are carved out of stone, that we've discovered that are from the 1st century, from the time of Jesus, like pre-70 AD or around that time. The descriptions in the various Gospels, they describe a specific kind of tomb. It's called an acrosolia, Acrosolia, acrosolia. This is also called a bench tomb. There's a bench that you can lay the body on. There's different ways they would do this. This is one of the most expensive kinds of tombs, so you would have to be a rich man to be able to afford it. It's a less common tomb for wealthy people. It also, being one of the more expensive ones, it's one of the few tombs that actually had a round stone, door. It wasn't really a door, but right, blocking the entryway. Other ones had different size and shaped stones. This had a round disc-shaped stone rolled in front of it, rolled downhill into a slot. It was easy to push down into place, but very difficult to remove. So the bench and the stone go together, and that's the description in the text. It's of a real tomb. These things connect. Only a few of these tombs have been discovered. Every one of them dates to the time of Christ. They're all reserved for rich and important people, such as like the members of the Sanhedrin. They're all found near the traditional site for Jesus's grave. Did you catch that? The traditional site for Jesus's grave is where they've actually found these tombs, all of these kinds of tombs. So that is just more confirmation. I mean, how many pieces of evidence do you need all pointing in the same direction before you go, okay, all right, it's historical. The empty tomb is historical. Now, some will resist it because as soon as you realize that the empty tomb is historical, you're very close to realizing Jesus rose from the dead.
Yep. And some people, it doesn't matter how much evidence you give them, they still won't believe. Because the Bible says they love darkness rather than light, because their deeds are evil, and they don't want to come to the light because they don't want their deeds to be reproved or exposed. That's why they reject the truth. Even, Jesus could be standing at them right in the face, and they still in their heart be like, man, I don't want this to be true. That's the sad truth and reality of it. But it is the truth. And some people, you can have all the evidence in the world and they'll still reject it because they love sin. That's why.
Let's see, there's more. The tomb is said to belong to Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin. That seems likely. The tomb is said to be in a garden, which is a likely place for a tomb back then. Specific tombs have been found just outside the Garden Gate in Jerusalem, the Garden Gate, and so there's a connection that's there. The Jewish high priest John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus, they have tombs that have been found near there. Therefore, it could have been a prestigious burial place, that location, the garden area near the Garden Gate. So it was also said to be a tomb in which no one else was laid. Now, tradition, Jewish belief then is like, hey, someone who's been crucified, their body, they're like defiled, they're like unclean. There's an uncleanness going on there. They receive the death penalty and that they're unclean. So it would be considered defilement to put their body in a tomb where anyone else was already there. Now, because they would have multiple people in a tomb, they lay the body out. After it decayed, they put it in an ossuary, little bone box about that big, about as big as a femur, longest bone in the body. Then they would put that box in the tomb in a crevice in one of the walls or something like that. And they would have that table out there for the next person, the next family member who died. So then they would just continually populate the tomb. But this is a tomb in which no one else had laid, and that's consistent. They wouldn't have wanted to typically lay a body of someone who'd been crucified in a tomb where someone else was. It would be just look very down upon in a very strong way. So these are incidental details that occur across multiple different sources that say, yeah, that looks historical. Number 11. I don't have enough fingers for this. The day of the burial was probably the day of preparation. Okay, so Joseph was able to buy a shroud. They could do that on the day of preparation. They could still buy a shroud. That's Mark 15:46. Multiple sources say that it was the day of preparation, which is the Friday before sundown. And this is Luke 23:54 and John 19:31. So we have different sources incidentally all pointing to the timing being consistent. Like it reads like it's history. Like, yeah, that's how it would be if it was really happening. All right, there's more. Number 12. Women observing the burial has marks of historicity, specifically women observing the burial.
Yeah, again, the testimony of women meant very little in the ancient world. So I think that is very strong evidence that it's true. Because, again, if it was false and if it was made up, the person that made up the story would have had the witnesses being men, not women, because men's testimony would have been more credible at the time. But it actually works in our favor in modern day today, because looking back, you understand that. And it points to like, wow, this was actually probably true because the embarrassing fact that it was women that gave the testimony, not men.
Let me see what time it is. All right, we're doing good. 5:49. I'm happy. Okay, number 12. In Mark's account, we read about women observing the burial multiple times. In Mark 15:40, they observe the crucifixion. In Mark 15:47, they observe the burial. In Mark 16:1, they observe the empty tomb. Now, remember last week's study, we talked about evidence that the Gospels are eyewitnesses. And we talked about how the use of names gives you a clue that they're the eyewitness that's being appealed to in this passage. Well, this is consistent here too. So Joseph Blinzler, he did a study of this, and he said the list of women is unchanged from Mark's source story because of the way the women's names appear. I'll just refer you to Joseph Blinzler. I'm trying to give reference to guys other than me. I'm not making stuff up. I'm not coming up with anything new. I'm just telling you things that these guys already know that point to the historicity of the empty tomb. So the women's accounts have marks of historicity for lots of reasons. We talked about embarrassment and all that. Okay. What else we got? 13. The Jewish practice of noting the gravesite. Oh, I guess I don't have that many. I put that one in there twice. It must be really important. I guess I don't have as many as I thought. All right. The real.
Yeah, Graham, I'm glad you're here. Which one of the Apostle Paul's letters did he write first? What's his oldest epistle? Because it came up earlier in the stream, and I was like, man, I wish Graham was here because I think he knows this information. I'm assuming it's Corinthians, but I could be wrong. So yeah, if you could leave in the side chat which epistle Paul wrote first, I'd appreciate that.
Real 13. No, oh gosh, okay. The last two on my list, like I literally just duplicated it. So this is 12 reasons to believe in the empty tomb. And then I'm going to give you one argument against the empty tomb. Forgive me, guys. Okay, one argument against the empty tomb, and here it is. And this is what actually Paul Ogia, the guy that I debated on the evidence for the resurrection, he did bring up this after the debate. I was hoping he'd bring it up in the debate because it was going to be an ambush moment for me. Darn. Roman practices of crucifixion would not allow people to be taken off the cross the day they were crucified. Generally speaking, this is true stories. This is true history here. Romans would leave you on the cross as a display to everyone around that you don't mess with Rome. They would not allow you to take the body off. They wouldn't allow you to have an honorable burial. None of that. That didn't happen in Rome. This was like not what Romans did. And we know that as we read about from Josephus about typical practices for Roman crucifixion. And so here's what they do. The skeptic will say, hey, this one fact of history that Romans generally did not allow you to remove bodies from the cross, it overrules all this stuff. And it shows us, even though we have 12 lines of evidence that point towards the historicity of the empty tomb, it overrules all of those lines of evidence because we have a general practice of Rome. But there's a problem here with arguing from general to specific, right? Like it's generally true that, say Hispanic men are 5'8" or something like, I don't know what their height is on average, but let's say it's generally true they're 5'8", and therefore a guy comes to me, he goes, hey, I'm Hispanic, and he says, and I'm 6'2". I don't say you're not 6'2" because Hispanic men are generally 5 foot. Like you don't argue from the general to the specific because we know that that's exactly the thing. General rules of thumb are just general. But there's a bigger issue with it, and it's this. The same guy, Josephus, who I have right here, not him, but his book, the Josephus, the same guy that tells us from the first century about Roman practices of crucifixion, he also writes that the Romans made specific exceptions to that rule for the Jews in Israel. Let me read to you what happened. In his book.
Yeah, see, that's awesome. I didn't know that either. Good stuff. Take notes.
The War of the Jews, section 317, he writes about how these Idumeans, or these mercenaries, were hired by Rome. Rome didn't have enough soldiers, so they hired these mercenaries to come in to put down a rebellion that was going on in Jerusalem. And the Idumeans didn't know the normal Roman ways of handling Jews. They know how Romans handle other things, right? They don't know how Romans handle Jews. So they treat the Jews the way they normally treat everyone else. They kill them and they don't allow them to be buried properly. And they freak out over it. So we read here in section 317, I'll just read it to you. Nay, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial. Although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those who were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. You see, Rome realized that with the Jews, they needed to have a couple special rules, right, to avoid violence, to avoid rebellion. One of the rules that they succumbed to, and they said, all right, fine, Jewish guys, we'll let you take your bodies off the cross. We'll let you bury them that night. We'll let you avoid the shame of having these crucified people stay up on the cross. This goes back to Deuteronomy, where it says, like, cursed is anyone who hangs on a tree, and you will not allow them to stay overnight. So they were obeying the Torah when they did this. So it's actually known Jewish practice to violate the normal Roman issues of how they handle crucifixion victims, meaning every piece of evidence points to the empty tomb. I don't know of any good evidence that points against it. I tried to find it actually in preparation, and there may be an argument I haven't heard. So don't think I'm trying to avoid dealing with them. Maybe there's an argument I haven't heard. I haven't heard a good one. I'd like to hear one. That if I have like 12, 13 good arguments pointing to the historicity of the empty tomb, and your only argument against it is ultimately, that really implies Jesus rose from the dead, so I don't like it. Well, then you don't have to like it for it to be true. So I hope.
Yeah, amen to that. Truth is truth, man, whether you like it or not. Truth is truth.
That this is something that is useful to you and useful to others. I'm going to go to your guys' questions. We'll do the Q&A now. And I'm going to continue doing for the next few weeks. I'm going to keep doing videos that, focus on, probably for the next month or so, month and a half, focus on the resurrection of Christ, evidence for the resurrection, challenges to the resurrection. And today it was the empty tomb, just one piece in the puzzle. And I thought it'd be good to go into it in great detail. And you guys, look, here's what blew me away when I studied this. 2,000 years later, we have this much evidence for the little details around the death and resurrection of Christ. There's an actual case, historical case for the resurrection of Jesus, for this miracle that is very strong. And I don't know of any sufficient rebuttal.
Yeah, and I believe God does that on purpose, just like he left evidence for the flood. He left evidence for Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe I should do a review on that video sometime. That's a really awesome video about the Sodom and Gomorrah find. But yeah, God leaves evidence on purpose. Christianity is not blind faith. There are reasons to believe. You see all these things and you're like, wow, it is true. You believe, God saves you. You come to know him. I mean, he doesn't, it's not blind faith. This is not Islam. This is the truth. Don't leave your brains behind. Bring your brain with you. Okay. We're not supposed to be stupid. Obviously, we believe things. There's strong reasons to believe.
To it. And I'm open to hearing them. I don't think they'll work, but I'd like to at least confront them and deal with them, So before I go to your guys' questions, I have a quick announcement. And I've already got some questions. Thanks for asking, guys. The announcement is this. I'm going to do a surprise live stream to reveal a secret project that I've been working on. And it's going to happen in half an hour at 6:30 p.m. And I'm going to go live, not on my channel. It'll actually be on What Do You Meme, John McCrae's channel. And me, John McCrae from What Do You Meme, and Cameron Bertuzzi from Capturing Christianity. We just also called The Atheist Voice, who has a very large YouTube channel series. So I put a link in the video description so you can follow that. Some really neat stuff too. So we're going to talk about that project then. All right, Austin Avenaki says, what are your thoughts on the Shroud of Turin? The fabric has been tested and attempted to be recreated. However, the image was cast on the fabric by way of light too bright to recreate.
So my personal opinion on the Shroud of Turin is I don't believe that was the cloth that was laid over Jesus. I don't think it was. But let's see what Mike says about it.
Mahalo. Hey, Austin. Austin's in Hawaii. He's told us before. So, hey, man, I haven't studied the Shroud of Turin enough. And here's the thing. Part of me thinks, hey, that's really interesting. Like, what if it's true? What if the Shroud of Turin is this big piece of evidence we can add to our arsenal? Another part of me says, because I don't know it well enough, I won't use it, because I don't want to bring in evidence that I later regret, because I don't need the shroud to prove Christianity. So I'm going to make sure I vet it carefully first. And I haven't even done the vetting yet.
Okay, that's a fair and honest answer. I can appreciate that. But I don't really trust much of anything the Vatican has. They're a bunch of liars.
So I haven't studied it, haven't looked into it in detail, just casually here and there. And I don't know the answer, to tell you the truth. So Lady Samurai says, does Gary Habermas have a list of the scholars that he has recorded that accepts the minimal facts of the resurrection? If so, where can we find it? If you go to garyhabermas.com, go to his website, he has tons of free material there, including, I don't know if he has a full list or not, but he has way more than people say. In 2005, he published a paper in the I think it was the Journal for Historical Jesus Studies. I think that's what it was. He published a paper. That paper is available on his site, actually even more content than the edited version that went in the journal. Tons of footnotes where he talks about lots of sources. And what he does in that paper, I read it in prep for this actual discussion. In that paper, he actually lists not just scholars who agree with him, but he lists and quotes scholars who are saying that, you know, this is the consensus view of other scholars. So it's not like we have one scholar; we have multiple scholars who are saying, yeah, this is consensus view. And he has that on his website there. I don't have the link because I don't think I saved it. It's somewhere in my notes. Maybe I can just find it real quick and put it in the chat for you. I think I can. Yeah, I can. It's right here. And I can't see my screen though because my camera's blocking it. Just a second. Let me get this link for you and then I will send it. And then I'll do the next question. Okay, so there's one location, and no, it doesn't have everything you're looking for, but there's one location, and no, it doesn't have everything you're looking for, but it has some really good stuff. One location, and there you go. There's one location, and no, it doesn't have everything you're looking for, but it has some really good stuff that will, I think, help you out. Okay, Chris Smith says, why do some critics question Habermas as being a reliable source? Is that a sufficient argument? No, I don't think I think they question him because I don't think they want his arguments to stand. I think that what he's saying is very powerful and very strong evidence for Christianity. He gives them all the ground they want. He says, fine.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that guy's evidence or his website before, so I don't know what he's listed as evidences. So I can't comment on that, but I can re-comment again on what I said earlier, is that people will reject all the evidence in the world because they love sin and they hate light. They love darkness and hate light. Some people, you could show them all the evidence and they will still reject it, not because of intelligence or intellectual reasons, but because of sin and their love for sin. That's honestly why most people reject the truth. Matter of fact, that's why all people that reject the truth reject it, is because of their sin. That's why.
Fine. I'll throw out all my evidence except the evidence that we have like a consensus of scholars on, or at least a majority. And so he only uses majority scholarship opinions, and he still builds a strong case for the resurrection. And that's like really annoying if you don't want to believe the resurrection. So they go ad hominem and they attack his character. Oh, well, he hasn't published enough and he hasn't written enough stuff. And it's like, well, you know, they need a better response than that, in my opinion. He puts his content up there on his website, like I posted for you to check out, and I do recommend you do. And he's not the only scholar saying these things. So even if you discredit Gary Habermas, you haven't discredited all of the other scholars that he is quoting. Okay, so Josie JQ says some scholars have considered the guard at the tomb account in Matthew 27 to be unreliable. How would you defend that text? I don't know of the case they bring against I've heard people mention it, but I don't know of the case they bring. How do they build a case that this didn't happen? I don't know how they build that case, so I can't respond to it. Maybe I'll get into that in my studies in the next month or so and be able to give you a better answer there, Josie. Jacob Seiler says, can you cover Israel only preterism in a video? Probably not anytime soon, Jacob. Probably not anytime soon. I've just got so much other.
Israel only preterism. I have never heard of that. My goodness, what is that? Do I even want to know? Probably not.
There's stuff I'm planning on doing right now, so I'm sorry to tell you, buddy. I wish I could. But I do have a debate on preterism. It's not Israel only preterism, but I do have a debate on preterism that is online. You could just put Mike Winger preterism debate, and you can see that. And we actually went back and forth on the topic. That might be something there that's useful for you. Flatground Aniel says, Mike Winger, are you prepared for Matt Dillahunty to go full-born naturalism of the gaps on you like he did with Mike Licona? You'll see when the time comes. I hope so. I mean, we have the truth. The unfortunate thing is we have to be the representatives of it, right? And so I hope and pray that I could do well in this debate, represent the character of Christ and the truth of Christ, and then also the wisdom of Christ in how I communicate the stuff. I appreciate your prayers. I am going to prepare well and try to be ready for as much as I possibly can. And we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. If not, if I fail, you'll expect a video on my channel that goes, why I failed in my debate with Matt Dillahunty. So we'll see. All right, from Josie J. How do you think the resurrection of Christ sets Christianity apart from all other religions? I think that's a great question, Josie. One of the ways that it sets
Because we're the only ones that believe in a risen Savior. Muhammad is still dead. Buddha is still dead. Confucius, all these other historical false prophets are still dead. Jesus is the only one that conquered death and rose again. And he's the only one that should be followed. Because if he has power over death, that's good enough for me. Guys, if I were to die, if I said 3 days from now I'm going to die and 3 days later I'm going to rise again and it happens, yeah, then you should probably believe the things that I say. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He said a lot of things. And the fact that he accomplished that proves he was who he said he is. Like, that's good enough for me.
it apart is Christianity is actually, this is really profound when you think about it. We're actually founded on a historical claim, right? Okay, for instance, Muhammad, you're supposed to believe because Muhammad said he was a prophet, right? Jesus, he says, don't believe me because I say so. Read John 5, right? Don't believe me because I say so. He says, believe me because of my works. And then he gives them the chief evidence. He goes, as Noah was 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth, so the or in the whale, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, or in the fish. I don't want to argue about fishes and whales right now. But this is a historical claim. Christianity is founded on the idea that this event actually happened in time, space, and history, not just this guy said he was from God. So it's way more than that. Jesus is the one who has prophecy foreshadowing and leading up to him. He's the one who has a historical miracle confirming him. And these are two things that nobody else has. It completely sets Christianity apart from other religions and other claims. You know, people, I once told a guy evidence after evidence for the Bible and for the resurrection. And I remember we were standing up at the top of the stairs at my church talking forever. Many times we had these conversations. And I said, man, why don't you give your life to Christ? Why don't you put your trust in Christ? You know, you have more than enough reason. And he says, Mike, I just need more evidence. There's just not enough evidence. And then I thought, okay, you know, I've been spending enough time defending Christianity with this gentleman. I'm going to ask him about what he believes. So I said to him, well, what do you think? You know, you don't have enough evidence for Christianity, but what do you believe? And he told me, well, I believe in reincarnation. So I asked, okay, well, you seem to have a high standard for evidence. What evidence do you have for reincarnation? And he said, I never thought about that before. Some people only require evidence for the things they don't want to believe. And that, unfortunately, was the case in this situation.
Good point, Mike. Absolutely. Absolutely. If there's something out there people want to believe, they will accept it with little to no evidence. You know, evolutionists do it all the time. Where's the evidence for your stupid, dumb, retarded theory? Well, I mean, this has to be true, or otherwise, what's the other explanation? Oh, I don't know. It was created.
Situation. Now later he came to Christ. By the way, he did come to Christ. So that was just part of the process, and he ended up coming to the Lord. So that was beautiful. But yeah. Okay, number 8. Cole Perkins says, has any atheist ever given you a list of evidence they would expect to see if Jesus actually did arise from the dead? I've never received an answer. No, I haven't got an answer, but in my experience, these answers tend to be off the cuff. They tend to be like, oh, well, I want Emperor Caesar Nero to say that he had seen Jesus, and I want it to be recorded. Or basically, they're just going to make it more evidence than there is. And that just tends to be a way of avoiding the evidence that there is by always saying we need more. Yeah. Number 9, Dodger Bend Railway says, I've been told the followers of Christ stole the body. Now, what's interesting is the stolen body theory, while it's the oldest theory, it is actually one of the worst. The idea that the body of Christ was stolen is refuted, in particular, by the willingness of the disciples and the eyewitnesses to actually suffer for their faith. And this is something that I want to do. I'm going to do a whole video on this one day.
Another great point, that these people were willing to die horrible deaths because they claimed that Jesus rose from the dead and that he did these things. And they didn't change their story. Now, it's true that, there's Muslims that blow themselves up for, 72 virgins or whatever. But if you were facing a horrible, atrocious death, and if you were lying about something, I don't think someone that was willingly lying would actually be willing to go to their death over what they were saying. I think that's really good evidence as well, that the disciples were telling the truth about what they thought that they had seen and that they did see.
Okay. Because recently there's a lady, a scholar named Candida Moss, who wrote a bunch of stuff trying to say the disciples weren't really persecuted and didn't die for their faith. In response to this, we have, I wonder if I have it in here somewhere. It probably fell off the cliff. We have a book by Sean McDowell, which I'm working my way through, giving us the historical evidence for the suffering of those eyewitnesses who, and the whole purpose of saying the disciples and eyewitnesses of the resurrection that they suffered is to say that they meant it. That's all we're saying. We're not saying this proves Jesus rose. No, it's a piece of the case pointing to the resurrection. But what it proves is that they were serious. They were genuine, meaning they didn't steal the body. So there's a whole case. Maybe I should do a video on, did the disciples steal the body? That might be an interesting video to do. Yeah. Okay, well, I will take a few more questions, you guys. I think I can go for about 8 or 9 more minutes. So I don't know if AJ, if you had any more, I should have warned you. If you had a couple more to send me over, you're welcome to do that. I see we have at least a couple skeptics in the audience there. Welcome, you guys. I really appreciate you being here. And I hope that you find this, the chat to be a friendly environment, even though we're going to tell you that we believe Christianity is true. And then we're going to try to answer your objections and stuff. I like what Johnny says. We need to expose Mike for who he truly is, a true follower of Christ. I like that. I had someone give me a nice compliment the other day. They sent me a message and said they searched Mike Winger false teacher, and nothing came up as far as like saying I was a false teacher. And I'm thought, well, I don't think that'll last. I mean, of course, there's going to be people who say that about everybody, but they felt good that at least there wasn't like this undercurrent of people coming against me there. So that's nice. Yeah, so if you guys have a question in the chat, put it in the chat. I'll watch for it right now. Question, okay, from Rick Gardner. Who is Matthew 7:21 through 24 referring to? Let's look at the passage right now. Matthew 7:21 through 24. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord.
Oh, Mike, I really hope you get this right. This has been, this passage has been dealt with wrongly by a few people that me, Graham, and Nicholas have already reviewed. John MacArthur, Paul Washer, and what's his name, Tim Conway or something like that. And they're saying that the Lord says, depart from me, I never knew you, because these people were pointing to the wrong works. And that is so off, like not even close. The reason why the Lord is saying, depart from me, ye who work iniquity, I never knew you, is because it's the fact they're pointing to their works at all. Instead of pointing to him and say, Lord, we trusted what you did, who you are. They were trusting in their works. That's the whole problem. Not that they were trusting the wrong works. Ugh. Mike, please get this right.
Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Okay, here's a passage of scripture that different groups will all fight over and they'll all try to claim. So I've recently done some Hebrew roots content, right? Hebrew roots people are going to say that this phrase lawlessness refers to people who are not observing Torah It's Torahlessness. Now, I think I've refuted that. I'll give more information on that. Why I just think that that's not what it means. It just means sin.
Well, my opinion is that the people are lawless because the unsaved are judged by the law. And the Bible says that if you offend in one point, you're guilty of all. So these people are obviously sinners. They've sinned. So they haven't kept the law. So therefore, they are antinomian, or they are lawless. And I think that's why Jesus says they're lawless, is because they've broken the law. They have never kept it.
I could actually bring it up if I want here. Let's see. Matthew 23 verse 8. And I wonder if you guys can read this. Oh no, not 23. Matthew 12. Where's the passage? 7:23. Wow, how did I get 23:8 out of that? Or was it 7:28? It's one of these verses. Lawlessness. Okay, so here's the word lawlessness. I can make it bigger for you, just in case this is coming from that Hebrew roots perspective. It's anomian, anomian, and it means to live lawlessly. This is here. I'll just give us one of these. Theological Dictionary of the New Testament gives us crazy amounts of information, probably way too much for us. Maybe.
Yep, like I just said, antinomian. Yeah, I was correct.
The little Kittle might be good. Or we'll do Lunita. Okay, sorry, I'm just bringing it up. I'm going to show you guys the Greek resources that are accessible here on Logos Bible Software, which is what I tend to use. So anomia, it's to behave with complete disregard for the laws or regulations of a society, to live lawlessly, lawlessness, the lawless living. They will gather up out of his kingdom all people who cause people to sin and who sin and do lawlessness. In some languages, one may translate it to live as though there were no laws, to refuse completely to obey the laws, or to live as one who despises all laws. So it's just speaking of people who are doing sinful things. Now, what people want to do sometimes is they want to grab this term lawless and they want to say it's all about the Torah. It's specifically about Jewish laws. And it is if you're a Jew. But there's also, according to Romans, a law the Gentiles have. And them not living according to what they know is right and wrong is them violating the law that's written on their hearts. And that's not the Torah, right? They're a law unto themselves. Who don't have the law, they're a law to themselves. So for them, living lawlessly would refer to that. And that's consistent with Romans, consistent with Matthew, and consistent with the usage of the Greek word. So I would say it's not that, but it could refer to ignoring Torah, but not specifically. It could also just be other things. So not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. I think that generically answering this passage is talking about people who are not really, they don't really know Christ and they don't really live for Christ, although they do things in the name of Christ. And it comes after a passage where it's talking about false prophets and sheep's and wolves' clothings and wolf and sheep's clothing. Sheep's and wolves' clothing. That's like some kind of weird kind of evangelism. Anyway, so it's talking about different kinds of trees. This is where Jesus is getting into basically a generic statement of a kind of person who claims the name of Christ, does big miracle type things in the name of Christ, but the fruit of their own lives, their character and the way they live their lives is not reflecting that they actually know Christ. And those, Jesus doesn't just say, you didn't do enough good works. He says, I never knew you. The fruit that was not good, it simply was evidence that they didn't know Christ to begin with. So I would speak of it very...
Okay. Thank you, Mike. I think you took a little longer than you needed to with that, but at least you came to the right conclusion. Thank you.
Generically in that sense. Yeah. Okay, I got a couple more questions. I'll do these and then we'll then I'm going to hand you guys over to the next live stream because I have another live stream we're doing tonight. If you're interested. Let's see. From Leanne Waters, she says, want to address the swoon theory. Okay, so the swoon theory is the idea that Jesus was only, like what the Princess Bride says, like mostly dead. Like Jesus didn't really die. He was just mostly dead. This seems to be refuted by several things. First off, you don't just mostly die on the cross. There's only one account we have of someone dying and not, or getting on the cross and not dying. And this is actually from Josephus also. He records about how friends of his, people he knows, were crucified. They were put on the cross, and he immediately ran and said, "Hey, these are my friends. Please take them off." And he used his authority with Rome and his place to get them taken down. I think the story is that 2 of them died, 1 of them survived, and this was only because they had the best medical treatment and they were taken down and medically treated right away off the cross. They did not experience the same kind of tortures Christ experienced, and everybody knew that they were alive and they were doing everything they could to save their lives, and still they barely made it. How does this relate to Christ? Well, Jesus was severely beaten. According to the record, Christ was severely beaten. He actually died on the cross without anyone killing him directly. But to assure this was happening, the soldiers stabbed him with the spear. And this is a historically validated idea. Josephus talks about how they wouldn't let people off the cross until they pierced them, until they stabbed them. This was like something that they would do to confirm that they were dead. So we have like extra biblical verification that this was like really a thing the Roman soldier would do. So they stabbed Jesus. That seems historical. He's blood and water pour out. That either was the water sac around the heart that burst, or it was that his lungs had filled with water and when he died. And so either way, he's definitely dead. There's no way he's alive at this point. But let's pretend he was. And so he goes into the tomb, and for 3 days he's there without food and without water, for however many hours it was. It wasn't 72 hours, but he's there for a long time with no food and no water. And then he comes out of the tomb somehow when no one expects him to. And somehow this limpy, gimpy Jesus, who's barely alive, he inspires the disciples to think that he is resurrected from the dead. Like, the disciples would not say Jesus had raised. They would say, look, he survived. God spared him. They tried to kill him, but he made it through. They would never say he rose from the dead. So we're just back to lying, them conspiratorially lying about things. It's not that different than the stolen body theory in reality. So it seems to be refuted by those things as well. So there's a few other things for you. I hope that helps. This is stuff off the top of my head. There's always more that I think about later. Oh, I should have shared that too. So I want you guys to know, when I answer questions, especially in Q&A, there's often better answers than what I'm giving you. I'm giving you what I can recall to try to meet your needs in the moment. But don't think that whatever Mike says is the best answer there can be. There's often better answers that even I discover later on, and I go, ooh, I'm adding that to my arsenal, and then I can share it there as well. Okay, last question, and it's from AJ Bernard. He says, can you give us some freestyle rapping like Vocab did? In my recent interview with Vocab Malone, we did some freestyle. He did some freestyle rapping. I didn't do any freestyle.
Yeah, not interested in that. So I'll end that video there. Yeah, that was pretty good. There's a couple things I didn't know that he brought up. No one has joined. I don't see any questions or comments on the video in the chat. I guess I'll end it then. Yeah, so I was still going to do the Leighton Flowers one. I just pushed it back. Thought this video would be more appropriate considering yesterday was Easter. So yeah, there you go. There's some evidence for Jesus rising from the dead. So anyone that sees this video that hasn't trusted in Jesus Christ, here's some historical evidence for you to look at. Again, Mike Winger's video, I put the link in the side chat. So if you rewatch this, you can go through the side chat and see the link. His YouTube channel is Mike Winger. Go check him out. He's pretty good. And yeah, so if you have never trusted Jesus, he is God, and he proved that by his resurrection. He claimed to be God. He went to the cross to suffer for the sins of the world because he did no sin. He was the only perfect one. Oh, what's this? 1 Corinthians is early, but Bible Gateway claims Galatians is first. Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you, Graham. And yeah, so he was the only perfect one that ever lived and walked on this world. And he decided to suffer and die for other people's sins. He was buried in the tomb, and 3 days later he rose again, proving exactly what he said he was going to do. He prophesied that he would rise, and he did. He made many claims that proved to be true by his resurrection. And he made another claim that if you believe on him, you have everlasting life and you will never perish. Trust him. You can trust Jesus. God always keeps his word. Hebrews 13:8 tells us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and forever. Yesterday, today, and forever. He does not change. What he said 2,000 years ago, he still means today. He keeps his word. And he also he promised to come back. And he will return. You can bank on that. Shalom, Iger. I'm about to close it down. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nah, bro, go right ahead, man. Just came in to say hi to you for a little bit, but I thought it was a great video you played. It was interesting. I never heard those talking points before.
Yeah.
It was good, but yeah, man, just came to say hi to you real quick. If you want, we could talk offline because I thought you ended it perfectly.
Sure. All right. Well, shalom and God bless you all. Trust Jesus Christ. See you next time.
Shalom.